The cold came first in dreams. Ben Carter woke in the dark lungs pulling thin mountain air that tasted like metal and fear. His hand found Ranger's fur before his eyes opened, fingers digging into the warmth, until the German shepherd's steady heartbeat pulled him back from the place where two men still froze in silence. The cabin walls resolved around him, rough pine and shadow, nothing like the canvas and metal of that final outpost. Nothing like the mountains east of Helmand, where the temperature dropped so fast it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. Ranger lifted his head, dark eyes catching the moonlight filtering through frost-kissed windows. The dog didn't whine or press closer. He simply waited the way he'd been trained to wait through gunfire and chaos and the long, terrible silences that followed. Ben's pulse slowed. His fingers loosened. The mountains outside these walls were different mountains. The cold here was just November settling into Montana, not the killing cold that crept through gear, rated for desert heat, and left men stiff and blue-lipped by dawn. He sat up bare feet, finding the worn floorboards his uncle had walked for 40 years. Robert Carter had been Navy Vietnam era, the kind of man who kept his stories locked behind a calm smile and hands that never stopped building. The cabin reflected that philosophy. Every beam fitted tight, every corner squared true, the kind of construction that said a man expected to weather storms and had no patience for shortcuts. Ben had inherited it 3 months ago, along with a note that said simply, "It's yours now, make it mean something." Outside the valley stretched dark and silent, under a sky sharp with stars. Black Pine Valley, population 200 give or take, whoever left for college and never came back. The kind of place where everybody knew which pew you sat in on Sunday and whether your woodshed needed a new roof before you did. Ben had grown up in a dozen places like this, moving every time his father's construction contracts ran dry, never staying long enough to be anything but the new kid, with the quiet voice and the habit of watching people too closely. He pulled on jeans and a flannel shirt that smelled like sawdust and started coffee on the propane stove. Ranger moved to the door, stood with his nose an inch from the frame, reading the night in ways Ben couldn't. The dog had been his partner for 6 years overseas, trained to detect explosives and insurgents and danger in all its patient forms. Now Ranger tracked deer and rabbits, but the intensity never left. Once a working dog, always a working dog. Ben understood that. Once a soldier, always a soldier. Even when the uniform came off and the orders stopped, and the only mission left was figuring out how to live in a world that didn't need constant vigilance. The coffee tasted bitter and good. Ben carried it onto the porch, boots crunching frost that glittered like broken glass. October had turned the aspens yellow and set the high peaks white, but the real cold hadn't settled yet. Black Pine Valley sat in a natural bowl ringed by ridges that caught snow early and held it late. Good land for ranching if you didn't mind the isolation. Good land for hiding if you needed space between yourself and the noise. His uncle's notebook sat on the small table he'd dragged outside yesterday, pages rippling in a breeze that tasted like winter coming. Ben opened it to the sketch he'd drawn 6 months ago during a sleepless night in a motel outside Kansas City. The design had come fully formed, like something remembered rather than invented. An extended roof wrapping 3 sides of a cabin, pitched steep to shed snow, supported by posts sunk 4 feet deep into ground that wouldn't shift when frost came. Elevated planks beneath to keep firewood dry even if snow piled 6 feet high. Cross bracing rated for the kind of wind that bent trees horizontal and tore sheet metal off barns. He'd drawn it thinking about Williams and Hayes, Sergeant Marcus Williams, 34 from Georgia, who'd shown Ben pictures of his daughters every night before rack. Corporal David Hayes, 26 from Oregon, who could fix anything with duct tape and faith, and usually some creative profanity. They died within an hour of each other, not from bullets or shrapnel, but from simple, brutal cold after a storm collapsed their supply tent and left them burning furniture for heat that couldn't compete with wind chill pushing -40. Ben had survived because he'd kept moving, kept hauling debris, kept his core temperature up through sheer stubborn momentum, and because Ranger had pressed against him all night like a furnace wrapped in fur. He'd survived and they hadn't, and for 3 years he'd carried that weight looking for a reason that didn't sound like random chance. The notebook design was part of that search. If he couldn't bring them home, he could make sure cold never took anyone on his watch again. Not from lack of preparation, not from something as stupid as wet firewood. The sun broke over the eastern ridge, turning frost to gold. Ben finished his coffee and went to work. The posts arrived on a flatbed at 8 fresh-cut lodgepole pines, still weeping sap. The driver, a weathered man named Frank Miller, who wore a deputy's badge on his off hours, helped Ben unload them one by one, grunting approval at their heft. You know, Robert used to order from the same mill. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans. Good timber. Hold straight even when the wind tries to convince it otherwise. Ben nodded, running his hand along smooth bark. His uncle had left detailed notes about suppliers who delivered on time and who talked big but brought junk. The mill was on the list with a single word beside it: reliable. Building something big. Frank's tone stayed casual, but his eyes tracked the posts Ben had already set yesterday, spaced in a pattern that didn't look like any shed the deputy had seen before. Weather protection. Ben kept his voice level, offering no elaboration. Frank waited for more, got nothing, and shrugged. Well, you need permits for anything. Structural county offices in town. Though between you and me, nobody's going to hassle you about a woodshed. Not out here. He drove off, trailing dust, and Ben got to work. Measuring came first stakes and string, creating a grid that wrapped the cabin on 3 sides, each corner, marked and double-checked. The ground was still soft enough to dig, but that window was closing. Another week, and frost would lock the earth tight until spring. He had time, but not much. Ranger patrolled the perimeter, nose down, tracking scents that probably included deer and coyote, and the fox Ben had seen yesterday slipping through the pines like red smoke. The dog never barked unnecessarily, never wasted energy on threats that didn't materialize. He worked with the efficiency of a professional, and people who didn't know better sometimes mistook that intensity for aggression. Ben had seen folks cross the street rather than pass close, had watched kids pull back when Ranger's dark eyes fixed on them with that unblinking focus. He understood. Ranger looked exactly like what he was, a weapon that had been pointed at enemies and had never quite figured out how to be anything softer. But Ben knew the truth. Ranger had pulled him from the edge more times than he could count, had sensed panic attacks before Ben did, and pressed close until the shaking stopped, had simply been there when the world felt too big and too loud and too full of people who couldn't possibly understand what it meant to watch brothers die from something as simple as weather. By noon, 3 posts stood vertical and true. Ben mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow his uncle had left, poured it thick around the bases, checked his level obsessively. The structure would hold or it wouldn't, and that outcome lived entirely in these early decisions. A post off by 2 degrees now meant a beam that wouldn't seat properly. Later meant gaps where wind could pry and snow could infiltrate, meant the difference between shelter and something that looked like shelter until the storm proved otherwise. A truck slowed on the county road, diesel engine downshifting. Ben didn't look up, just kept working, but Ranger's ears swiveled toward the sound. The truck stopped. Door opened and closed. Boots on gravel. Afternoon. The voice carried the easy confidence of someone used to being heard. Ben turned. The man approaching was early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing jeans and a work shirt that had seen actual work. His face had the permanent squint of someone who spent days outside, and his handshake when he offered it was firm, without trying to prove anything. Tom Mason, run the farm about a mile west. Saw Robert's nephew finally made it out here. Ben Carter. He released the handshake and stepped back, giving himself space. Tom's eyes swept over the posts, the stacked lumber, the careful grid of stakes and string. Building something substantial. Most folks just throw a tarp over their wood and call it done. Tarps leak. Tom chuckled, a sound that seemed genuine rather than polite. Can't argue that. Lost a whole cord last spring when mine tore. Wood sat soggy until July. He tilted his head, studying the layout. This looks more involved than a tarp, though. Extended roof. Ben gestured at the notebook lying open on the tailgate of his truck. Keeps firewood dry regardless of snow depth or wind direction. Tom stepped closer, squinting at the sketch. That's some engineering. You do this kind of work before Army. Ben didn't elaborate. Ah. Tom nodded slowly, and something shifted in his expression, not quite sympathy, but acknowledgement. Well, Robert always said you had good sense. Guess it runs in the family. He looked at Ranger, who stood motionless 10 feet away, watching without apparent emotion. That's a serious-looking hog. He's serious about his job. What's his job these days? Keeping me alive. Ben said it flat, not quite joking, and Tom's smile faltered for a second before recovering. Fair enough. Well, I won't keep you. Sarah, that's my wife. She wanted me to invite you to church this Sunday. Potluck after. Good way to meet folks. Appreciate it. I'm still settling in. Sure, sure. Offer stands, though. We're friendly out here once you get past the initial nosiness. Tom headed back to his truck, then paused. You need help with any of this, just holler. Got teenage boys who could use the education in actual construction. I'll keep that in mind. Tom drove off and Ben returned to his concrete. Ranger moved closer, leaning briefly against Ben's leg before resuming his patrol. The dog understood. People meant complications, conversations that required navigation energy spent on social calculus that never came naturally. Ben could do it when necessary, could mirror the expected responses and maintain eye contact and laugh at jokes he didn't find funny. But it cost him, left him drained and irritable, and out here with work to do and winter coming, the cost felt too high. By evening, 6 posts stood vertical. Ben's shoulders ached in familiar ways, the good pain of labor that produced results. He fed a Ranger a cold stew from a can, sat on the porch watching darkness fill the valley. Lights appeared one by one in distant houses, warm squares against the black. People settling in for the night, safe in their routines, trusting that tomorrow would look like today, and that winter would arrive on its usual schedule with its usual intensity. Ben checked his weather radio. The forecast promised seasonal temperatures, normal precipitation, and average winter by Montana standards. The Farmer's Almanac told a different story. He'd bought it at Miller's General Store yesterday, drawn by the old man behind the counter, who'd looked at him and said without preamble, "You're Robert's nephew." He trusted this book more than the TV weatherman. Said it never lied to him. The almanac predicted early cold, heavy snow, a winter that would hit hard and stay long. Ben had learned to trust patterns. Animals knew. His uncle had known. The deer were already moving to lower elevation, the squirrels gathering with unusual urgency, the aspens dropping leaves 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Nature didn't lie. It just told truth in a language most people had forgotten how to read. He worked by lantern light until 10, cutting lumber for cross beams, measuring twice and sawing once, creating a stack of components that would eventually transform vertical posts into a structure. Ranger dozed nearby, twitching occasionally in dreams that probably involved running. Ben envied him that. His own dreams rarely involved anything as simple as running. The nightmares came again, at 3, pulling him from shallow sleep into the familiar loop. Canvas tearing in wind, temperature dropping so fast he could feel it through gloves and jacket and layers that should have been enough. Williams coughing, Hayes curled on his side, both of them shutting down by degrees while Ben kept moving, kept trying to keep them conscious, kept believing a rescue would arrive before biology won. It hadn't. They'd stopped responding, stopped breathing, stopped being anything but shapes under frost-stiffened blankets, while Ben held them and whispered things that didn't help and wouldn't matter and couldn't change the fundamental arithmetic of human bodies versus cold. Ranger pressed his full weight against Ben's chest, warm and solid, and here, not then, not there. Ben's hands found fur and held on. The cabin walls stayed cabin walls. The frost on the windows was Montana frost, beautiful and temporary, not the killing kind. He was safe. He was home, or as close to home as he'd been in years. The past couldn't reach him here unless he let it, but preparation could. That was the deal he'd made with memory. He couldn't save Williams and Hayes, but he could make sure Black Pine Valley never lost anyone to something as preventable as wet firewood. He could build something that mattered. He could keep the promise he'd made, standing over 2 flag-draped coffins, the promise that their deaths wouldn't be meaningless, that he'd learn the lesson and carry it forward. Morning came cold and clear. Ben worked through breakfast, through lunch, through the long afternoon, while tourists who didn't know better would have found the temperature pleasant. He knew better. The cold had teeth. They just hadn't bit down yet. By the 3rd day, the structure's skeleton began to emerge. Posts connected by horizontal beams cross-bracing, creating triangles that distributed load and resisted shear forces. The design wasn't pretty, wasn't trying to win architectural awards. It was built for a single purpose, executed with mechanical precision, and if that made it look military or cold or unwelcoming, Ben couldn't bring himself to care. Function mattered. Appearance was luxury. More trucks slowed. More neighbors stopped. Tom's wife Sarah arrived with 2 kids in tow, a girl about 9 and a boy maybe 7. She brought homemade pie and polite questions, her eyes taking in the construction with curiosity that felt genuine rather than judgmental. Tom mentioned you were Robert's nephew. I'm Sarah. These are Lily and Max. Ben Carter. He accepted the pie, unsure what to do with it. This wasn't necessary. Neither is building something this elaborate just to keep wood dry. But here we are. Sarah smiled and it reached her eyes. Robert was good to us. When Max broke his arm falling out of the barn loft, Robert drove us to the hospital because our truck wouldn't start. Least we can do is welcome his family. Lily had crept closer to Ranger, who stood motionless, allowing inspection. The girl reached out slowly, and Ben almost called her back, but Ranger lowered his head and let her small hand rest on his muzzle. Something in Ben's chest loosened. He's beautiful. Lily's voice carried wonder. What's his name, Ranger? Like a park ranger, like an army ranger. Oh, she processed that, then asked with child directness, did he fight bad guys? He kept soldiers safe. Ben chose his words carefully. That was his job. Is it still his job? Now he keeps me safe. From bad guys, from bad days. Sarah called her daughter back, but Lily lingered, looking at Ranger with something like awe. Can I visit him again if your parents say it's okay? They left with promises to bring more pie, and Ben returned to work feeling slightly less alone. The feeling didn't last. By evening, a different truck arrived. This one belonged to Pastor David Grant, recognizable from the large cross hanging from his rearview mirror and the bumper sticker that read, Faith Moves Mountains. The pastor was late 50s, gray hair combed back, wearing slacks and a polo shirt that split the difference between casual and ecclesiastical. His handshake was warm, his smile practiced, but not insincere. Ben Carter, I presume. Robert spoke highly of you. Said you had his gift for building things to last. Appreciate that. Ben didn't elaborate, hoping brevity would discourage lingering. It didn't. The pastor walked a slow circle around the construction, hands clasped behind his back, making small noises of consideration. The congregation's been curious. Some folks wondering about your plans here. Just weather protection. Seems extensive for firewood. Montana winters are extensive. Pastor Grant laughed, but his eyes stayed serious. True enough. Though we've had folks build bunkers before, usually because they thought the end times were coming or the government was overstepping. Creates tension in a small community when people think someone's preparing for trouble instead of weather. I'm preparing for winter. Ben met the pastor's gaze directly. Nothing more complicated than that. Of course, Grant raised placating hands. I'm not suggesting anything untoward, just passing along what I've heard. Small towns talk. Best way to quiet that talk is to be part of the community. Sunday services, 10 o'clock. You'd be welcome. I'll think about it. You do that. Grant headed back to his truck, paused at the door. Robert never missed a Sunday in 40 years. Said it kept him grounded. Might do the same for you. He drove away, trailing implications, and Ben felt Ranger press against his leg. The dog always knew when tension spiked, when the effort of being social started costing more than it returned. Ben scratched behind Ranger's ears, grateful for a companion who didn't require explanation. The work continued. Days blurred into each other, marked by progress rather than calendar. 10 posts became 12. Crossbeams connected them. The skeleton took shape, and with it came understanding of what Ben was building. Not a shed, not a simple structure. Something deliberate and fortified, something that suggested preparation for scenarios most people didn't want to imagine. The whispers started at Miller's General Store. Ben heard them while buying nails, threading through conversations that dropped to murmurs when he approached. Carter's building a compound. That dog looks like it could tear you apart. You ever see his eyes cold, like he's seen things? Makes sense coming back from over there. They don't all come back right. Ben paid for his nails and left. Ranger followed, silent and watchful. The whispers didn't matter. Let people talk. Let them wonder. When winter came early and hard, when snow buried their woodsheds and their tarps tore, and their fires sputtered on damp logs, they'd understand. Or they wouldn't. Either way, Ben's firewood would stay dry. Eleanor Price proved the exception. The widow lived alone a mile up the valley road, her husband dead 5 years from a heart attack that took him in his sleep, merciful and quick. She stopped by on a Wednesday morning, driving a pickup, older than Ben, wearing flannel and work boots that had walked a lot of miles. You're building like Robert did. She studied the structure with approving eyes. Most folks these days want easy and fast. Robert understood that solid takes time, trying to honor his example. You're doing more than that, Eleanor pointed at the notebook lying open nearby. That's engineering. That's someone who knows what happens when preparation fails. Ben said nothing, unsure what she wanted. I was a trauma nurse, 30 years Billings Regional. Saw what happens when people underestimate cold. Hypothermia doesn't care about luck or good intentions. It just takes what it takes. Eleanor met his gaze squarely. Whatever you saw that taught you to build like this, I'm sorry you saw it. But I'm glad you're putting the lesson to use. She left a container of cookies, climbed back in her truck, and drove away. Ben stood holding the cookies, feeling something uncomfortably close to gratitude. Ranger nosed his hand and he fed the dog an oatmeal cookie, breaking rules, because some moments deserved acknowledgement. October 25th brought the first hard frost, the kind that killed gardens, and sent smart animals deeper into their winter preparations. Ben woke to windows traced with ice crystals, beautiful and ominous. The valley had transformed overnight into something sharper, colder, more honest about what was coming. He worked faster. The structure was 65% complete, the roof framework beginning to take shape, but winter wouldn't wait for him to finish at a comfortable pace. He started working by lantern light, before dawn, pushing until dark, fueled by urgency that had no rational basis beyond instinct and the behavior of animals who were gathering with unusual intensity. Deputy Miller stopped by on his rounds, leaning against his cruiser, while Ben hauled another beam into place. Early frost this year. Old-timers at the diner say it means mild winter coming. Nature compensates, or something like that. Nature doesn't compensate. Ben secured the beam with temporary bracing. It just is. You sound pretty sure about that. I've seen what happens when people trust weather to be predictable. Miller nodded slowly, some understanding passing across his features. Fair enough. Well, you need anything, Sheriff's Department is here to help. That's what Robert always said anyway. He was good people. I'm guessing you are too. He drove away and Ben returned to work. The compliments settled uncomfortably. Good people didn't survive when brothers died. Good people found a way to save everyone. Ben wasn't good. He was just thorough. The nightmares intensified as the structure grew. They came every night now, pulling him from sleep into cold that felt real enough to make him check the cabin temperature, to make him pile blankets on the bed, and pull Ranger close and wait for his heart to remember it was allowed to beat at a normal pace. He sat on the porch at 3 in the morning, wrapped in Robert's old coat, watching stars wheel overhead in patterns that would have awed him if he'd had energy left for awe. Ranger sat beside him, patient as stone. The valley slept. The mountains stood. The frost glittered like accusations. You ever wonder if we're preparing for the wrong thing? Ben spoke quietly, not expecting answer. What if the storm doesn't come? What if I'm building all this for something that won't happen? Ranger leaned against him, and that was answer enough. Preparation wasn't about certainty. It was about refusing to be caught unprepared again, about honoring the dead by making sure their lessons survived them, about building something solid in a world that felt increasingly fragile. The structure reached 70% completion on November 1st. The roof framework stood complete, waiting only for the metal sheeting that would turn it from skeleton into shelter. The elevated flooring was installed, creating a platform 18 inches above ground that would stay dry even if snow piled waist-high. The whole thing looked industrial and stark and utterly unlike the picturesque woodsheds dotting the valley with their rustic charm and their vulnerability to weather that exceeded expectations. Ben stood back, studying his work with critical eyes that found flaws no one else would notice. The northwest corner post could use additional bracing. The drainage channels needed deeper routing. The entry needed a windbreak panel. Nothing was perfect, but it was close. Close enough to work. Close enough to save lives if the worst happened. Snow flurries arrived that afternoon, fat flakes that melted on contact but carried a message. The gate was opening. Winter was testing the locks. Soon it would push through with force that wouldn't be denied. Tom Mason stopped by, bringing teenage boys who looked at the structure with expressions caught between skepticism and grudging respect. This is impressive, Tom said, walking the perimeter. Way more than I thought you were building. Winter's way more than most people think it is. Ben gestured at the framework. This isn't about the winter we expect. It's about the one we don't. You think it's going to be bad. I think preparation doesn't hurt either way. Tom nodded slowly, then asked the question Ben had been expecting. You've got room for a lot of wood under there, planning to supply the whole valley, planning to make sure I don't run out. Smart. Tom paused, choosing words carefully. Some folks are nervous. They see all this and wonder what you're preparing for that they're not seeing. They're not looking. Ben kept his voice level. Deer moving early, squirrels frantic, birds gone 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Animals know. They always know. And you know because I've seen what happens when people ignore the signs. Tom studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, I'll trust that. And for what it's worth, Eleanor Price has been telling everyone in church that you're the only person in the valley with sense. That counts for something. Tell her I appreciate it. Tell her yourself, Sunday service, 10 o'clock. Tom grinned. She asks about you every week. The boys helped carry lumber for an hour, working with teenage energy that covered inexperience. They asked questions about the military, about Ranger, about whether Ben had killed anyone. Ben answered the first two and ignored the third. Some questions didn't deserve answers, and some answers would only feed the wrong kinds of curiosity. When they left, Ben continued working alone, which suited him. The structure demanded precision, and precision required focus that didn't accommodate conversation or distraction. He lost himself in measurement, in level checks, in the simple satisfaction of components fitting together exactly as designed. The sun set, early winter's preview, and still he worked. Ranger brought him his gloves when he left them on the porch, brought him water when his hands were full, sat quietly when Ben needed to think through a problem. The dog was partner more than pet, colleague more than companion, and the relationship worked because neither expected more than the other could give. November 2nd arrived with temperatures 20 degrees below normal and a sky the color of old bruises. The Weather Service called it a cold snap, temporary and localized. The Farmer's Almanac said nothing because it had already said everything predictions printed months ago that looked more accurate by the day. Ben drove to Miller's General Store for the last supplies, moving through the familiar ritual of gathering materials, while half the town pretended not to watch and the other half watched openly. He heard the whispers again, louder now, less careful about his proximity. Building himself a fortress. Probably thinks the Chinese are invading. I heard he's got PTSD, talks to himself at night. That dog's trained to kill. I wouldn't let my kids near him. Ben paid for his supplies and left. The opinions of people who didn't prepare for disaster didn't matter. Their fear didn't matter. When the storm came, they'd understand, or they wouldn't, and their understanding wouldn't change what happened next. Back at the cabin, he worked through the afternoon, racing daylight that fled earlier each day. The structure was 80% complete now, close enough to functional that he could start stacking wood beneath it, creating organized rows that would shed moisture and catch airflow and stay ready no matter what winter brought. He was measuring the final roof panel when Tom's truck returned, moving faster than usual, pulling a rooster tail of dust. Tom jumped out, phone in hand, an expression urgent. Ben, you got a weather radio. In the cabin, turn it on. They just issued a severe winter storm watch. System developing faster than predicted. They went inside together. The radio crackled with official warnings wrapped in bureaucratic language that boiled down to simple truth. Major storm 48 to 72 hours out. Heavy snow, high winds, rapid temperature drop. Ben listened with the part of his brain that still lived in Afghanistan, the part that heard warnings in multiple languages and always prepared for worse than described. Tom watched him, nervous energy radiating. How bad you think this gets? Bad enough that tarps won't help. What should I do? Make sure your wood is accessible. Stock extra food. Fill bathtubs with water in case pipes freeze. Check your generator. Tom was writing notes on his phone. And keep your family inside when it hits. You've done this before, not here. But I've seen what happens when cold catches people unprepared. Tom left, promising to spread warnings, and Ben returned to his work with renewed intensity. 48 hours, maybe 72 if they were lucky. He needed the roof panel secured, needed the last support braced, needed to stack as much wood as possible before the window closed. He worked through dinner, through exhaustion, through the point where his hands shook and his vision blurred. Ranger brought him water, pushed him toward the cabin when midnight arrived, refused to let him continue when continuation meant collapse. Inside, Ben sat on the edge of the cot, hands trembling from exertion and something older than muscle fatigue. The storm was coming. The animals knew. The sky knew. His bones knew. And for the first time since Afghanistan, He would face winter with preparation instead of hope, with structure instead of prayer, with dry firewood and solid shelter instead of wet canvas and blind faith. Williams and Hayes were dead. He couldn't change that. But Black Pine Valley was alive, and if the storm was as bad as instincts suggested, his preparation would matter, would save lives, would keep the promise. Ranger pressed against him warm and steady. Ben's hands found fur and held on. Tomorrow he'd finish. Tomorrow he'd stack the last of the wood. Tomorrow he'd make sure that when winter came with teeth bared, this valley would survive because one man had seen cold wind before and refused to let it win again. The radio continued its steady warnings, bureaucratic monotone, failing to convey urgency that Ben felt in his marrow. He made coffee he didn't drink, studied his plans one final time, checked supplies with military precision, slept in 2-hour increments, waking to check weather updates and sky conditions and the behavior of Ranger, who paced more than usual, reading approaching danger in ways humans couldn't. Dawn of November 3rd broke gray and heavy. Ben stepped outside into air that tasted like metal and carried weight that pressed down like atmosphere at higher elevation. The valley had gone quiet, that eerie stillness before violence when even wind held its breath. He worked with focused desperation, securing the final roof panel, adding last-minute bracing, stacking cord after cord of split wood beneath shelter that would keep it dry when everything else failed. The structure stood complete now, stark and functional, wrapping 3 sides of the cabin in protection that looked excessive until you understood the math of snow load and wind pressure and what happened when both hit simultaneously. By noon, the first snow arrived. Not flakes, but pellets, hard and mean-driven horizontal by wind that had found its voice. Temperature dropped 10 degrees in an hour, 20 in 2. The sky lowered until it pressed against the mountain peaks like a ceiling collapsing in slow motion. Ben's hands ached from cold despite gloves. His face burned from wind that carried ice crystals sharp as ground glass. But the wood was stacked. The structure was complete. The cabin was sealed. He'd done everything possible, and now came the part where preparation either proved sufficient or revealed itself as hubris. He called Ranger inside and closed the door against wind that howled protest. The fire crackled in the hearth, fed by wood that had stayed perfectly dry under Robert's old tarp system. Ben would have that luxury for a few more days. After that, the structure would prove itself or fail, and the valley would learn whether his preparation had been wisdom or paranoia. The radio updated storm arriving 12 hours ahead of schedule, intensity exceeding predictions, whiteout conditions expected, all residents advised to shelter in place. Ben made dinner he barely tasted, checked window seals, added extra wood to the fire, sat in the gathering dark with Ranger pressed against his legs, listening to wind that built from howl to scream to something that sounded like rage. The storm was here. The test had begun. And somewhere in the valley, families were realizing their woodsheds weren't as secure as they'd believed, their tarps weren't as reliable as they'd hoped, their preparation wasn't as thorough as winter required. Ben stared into flames that danced with shadows. He'd made a promise, built a structure, done everything knowledge and experience demanded. Now came the part where he learned whether it was enough. Outside, the blizzard slammed into Black Pine Valley with force that rattled windows and tested every seal, every corner, every assumption about what Montana winter could deliver. Something crashed in the distance, a branch tearing free or a structure failing under the assault. Ranger's ears pricked toward the sound body tensing. Easy, boy, Ben's hand found the dog's back. That's not our fight yet, but morning would bring fights enough for both of them. Inside, Ben Carter sat beside his dog and waited for the screaming to begin. The storm hit Black Pine Valley like a fist through glass. Ben woke to darkness, absolute, and wind that sounded like artillery, the kind of sustained barrage that didn't pause for breath or mercy. The cabin walls shook. Something outside tore loose with a crack that could have been lumber or bone. Ranger stood at the window, hackles raised, growling at weather that had become an enemy. 3 in the morning. Temperature outside had dropped to 5 below zero and falling. Visibility through the frost-caked window measured in inches, not feet. The world had vanished into white chaos that swallowed everything beyond the glass. Ben fed the fire, watching flames that seemed fragile against the assault. The structure he'd built stood somewhere in that maelstrom, either holding or failing, and he wouldn't know which until dawn revealed the aftermath. His hands moved through familiar routines, coffee checking supplies, running mental inventory of what he had versus what the valley would need if this storm delivered on its threat. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. All roads closed. Power out across 3 counties. Wind gusts recorded at 67 miles per hour before the weather station lost its anemometer to ice accumulation. Residents advised to shelter in place and maintain heat by any means necessary. Translation, people were going to if they couldn't stay warm, and emergency services couldn't reach them even if they called. Ben pulled on layers, preparing to check the structure at first light. Ranger paced, sensing intention and demanding inclusion. The dog moved with a determination that transcended any discomfort, ready, despite the brutal conditions waiting outside. "You stay here." Ben's voice carried command weight, the tone that had moved soldiers through chaos. "Guard the cabin." Ranger whined, a sound so rare it stopped Ben cold. The dog never questioned orders, never balked at being left behind. But something in the storm's voice had triggered instincts deeper than training, and Ranger understood what Ben was walking into better than human forecasts could predict. "I'll be back. Promise." Ben gripped the dog's muzzle gently, looking into dark eyes that had seen mortar fire and improvised explosives and men dying in ways that made cold seem merciful. "We've survived worse." Ranger's whine faded to acceptance. He moved to the door and sat prepared to wait however long waiting required. Dawn arrived gray and violent. Ben stepped onto the porch into wind that tried to strip the breath from his lungs. Snow didn't fall so much as attack horizontally, ice pellets that stung exposed skin and found every gap in clothing. The structure loomed through the chaos, dark and solid roof, intact posts holding. Relief lasted until he reached the woodpile and saw what the night had delivered elsewhere. Tom Mason's property was barely visible through the storm, but enough showed to reveal disaster. The woodshed's roof had torn completely, free tumbling end over end across frozen ground until distance swallowed it. Wood that should have been under cover lay exposed to accumulation that buried it under 2 feet and climbing. Without that wood, without heat, Tom's family had hours before cold became critical. Ben's radio crackled. Tom's voice came through broken and desperate fighting static that tried to erase words. "Kids are freezing. Can't get the wood. Everything's buried. Ben, if you can hear this." The broadcast cut to white noise. Ben stood in wind that wanted him dead, doing math that had no good answers. His cabin held enough wood for days, maybe a week if he rationed. The valley held 200 people in scattered houses, some close and some miles distant, all of them realizing simultaneously that weather didn't care about normal preparations. He could stay safe, ride it out alone. Nobody would blame a man for surviving when helping meant dying, except he would blame himself. He'd blame himself every time memory conjured Williams going still, or Hayes stopping breathing, or the terrible silence after brothers became corpses. Ranger was at the door before Ben reached it, reading intention in posture and pace. The dog's eyes held questions. Ben couldn't answer how many, how far, how much risk, calculated against odds of success. But Ranger had never asked for safe, just purpose, just a mission worth the cost. "We're going out." Ben's hands moved through gear checks with precision born from repetition. Rope sled, first aid kit, emergency flares, compass, the kind of loadout you carried when extraction wasn't guaranteed. Tom's family first. Then we assess. The rope was 50 feet of climbing rated cord, one end secured to the porch support beam, the other clipped to Ben's belt. The sled was military surplus, designed for Arctic operations, low-friction runners, and high-capacity bed. He loaded it with split firewood enough to restart a dead fire and keep it burning for hours. Weight that would make travel brutal, but might make the difference between hypothermia and survival. Ranger pressed against his leg, ready despite conditions that would test them both. Ben wanted to order him to stay, wanted to keep the one good thing in his life safe from the storm's appetite. But he'd seen Ranger track through worse, and right now he needed those tracking skills more than he needed the comfort of leaving his partner protected. "Stay close. Find them if I can't." Ben pulled the door open and the storm swallowed them whole. Visibility measured in arm's length. The world reduced to white static in wind that roared with vocabulary beyond language. Ben leaned into it, using the rope as lifeline, feeling his way toward Tom's property with compass bearing and dead reckoning, and faith that the quarter-mile distance hadn't somehow expanded in the chaos. Ranger ranged ahead to the rope's limit, then circled back nose-working, despite ice that crusted his muzzle. Tracking in a blizzard should have been impossible, but the dog found scent anyway. Human fear had a signature that weather couldn't erase completely. He pulled left, correcting Ben's course by 10 degrees, leading them toward habitation that existed somewhere in the screaming white. 20 minutes for a distance that should have taken 5. Ben's face went numb despite the balaclava. His hands ached inside insulated gloves. The sled caught on drifts that appeared without warning, forcing him to haul and kick and curse his way forward. This was the cold that killed. Not dramatic or cinematic, just relentless subtraction of body heat until systems failed and biology surrendered. Ranger barked sharp and urgent. Ben squinted through the chaos and found structure. The Mason house window's dark chimney producing no smoke. He stumbled to the door and hammered with a fist he couldn't feel. 30 seconds of eternity before the door cracked open. Tom's face appeared pale and terrified, breath pluming in air that shouldn't be this cold inside a home. Behind him, Sarah held both kids wrapped in every blanket they owned, all three shaking with cold that had moved past uncomfortable into dangerous. Ben, Jesus Christ, Ben, I didn't think we couldn't reach the wood. The shed roof is gone. I tried, but the storm. Tom's words tumbled over each other, shock and relief making coherence difficult. Where's your fire? Ben pushed inside Ranger, following both of them, trailing snow that melted instantly on floorboards, still warm enough to matter. Died an hour ago. Used everything we could reach. Furniture, books, Max's dresser. Sarah's voice cracked. The kids are so cold. Ben moved to the hearth, assessing. Coals still glowed beneath ash enough to restart if he acted fast. He pulled tinder from his pack dryer, lint, and petroleum jelly, the kind that caught even when wet, and built a foundation. Added kindling from the sled. Blew gently until flames licked upward with heat that felt like salvation. Lily crept closer, drawn by warmth despite her mother's restraining hand. She looked at Ranger with recognition that cut through fear. You came back. You and Mr. Carter came back. Told you we would. Ben fed the fire larger pieces, watching it build, feeling the room's temperature shift from lethal to merely dangerous. This'll hold for a few hours. I brought enough wood to get you through the worst. You can't go back out there. Tom's protest carried the weight of someone who understood what the storm could do. You'll die. People will die if I don't. Tom opened his mouth to argue, saw something in Ben's expression that made argument pointless, and closed it again. What do you need from us? Stay inside. Keep this fire going. Ration the wood. Ben moved toward the door, checking the rope still clipped to his belt. If the storm lets up, check on Eleanor Price. She's alone. Ben Sarah started, then stopped, holding her children tighter. Thank you. We wouldn't have... Thank you. Ben nodded and stepped back into the blizzard. The door closed behind him, sealing the Mason family in temporary safety, while he returned to chaos that had intensified during the brief respite. Wind speed had increased. Temperature had dropped another 5 degrees. What had been brutal was now approaching unsurvivable for anyone caught outside without preparation. The rope guided him back toward his cabin, but halfway there, Ranger veered off course, barking with urgency that overrode even storm noise. The dog had found something. Someone. Ben followed trusting instincts that had saved his life more times than he could count. Eleanor Price's house materialized through the white, small, and dark and wrong. No smoke, no lights, no signs of life in a structure that should have been radiating heat into the frozen air. Ben's stomach dropped. The widow lived alone. If her heat had failed, if she couldn't reach help, if age and isolation had conspired with weather, the door was frozen shut, ice sealing it better than any lock. Ben kicked it once, twice, a third time before the frame splintered and the door crashed inward. The interior was tomb-cold temperature, barely above freezing, and Eleanor lay on the couch wrapped in Afghans that couldn't compete with physics. Her eyes fluttered open when he touched her shoulder. Unfocused. Confused. Hypothermia's early stages stealing cognition while body temperature dropped toward critical thresholds. She tried to speak, but words wouldn't form, just syllables that meant nothing and everything. Robert, her voice was paper thin. Is that you? It's his nephew, ma'am. Ben Gritter. I'm getting you warm. He worked fast, building fire from her meager wood supply, supplemented with furniture he broke without hesitation. Antique chair became kindling. Coffee table became fuel. Things could be replaced. Eleanor Price could not. The fire caught and built casting heat that seemed inadequate against the cold that had claimed the room. Ranger pressed against Eleanor, sharing body heat while Ben worked. The dog's training had included wounded soldier protocols, and an old woman dying from cold triggered those same responses. Eleanor's hand found Ranger's fur and held on with grip strength that suggested she wasn't gone yet, just close enough to see the edge. So cold. Eleanor's words came clearer as warmth started winning. I called for help, but the phone, the lines. I know. Ben wrapped her in blankets. He'd brought the emergency Mylar kind that reflected body heat and fought entropy. You're going to be okay. Fire's going, temperature's rising, you'll be warm soon. You came. Through the storm. Eleanor's eyes found focus locked onto Ben's face with intensity that cut through confusion. You came when you didn't have to. I came because I did have to. Ben left half his remaining firewood, more than Eleanor needed, but less than he'd wish. Her color was returning, shivering, replaced by warmth-induced drowsiness. She'd survive. The house would hold. He had other homes to check. Outside, the storm raged with undiminished fury. Ben's rope led him back toward his cabin, toward safety, toward the sensible choice. But the radio on his belt crackled with new voices. Deputy Miller coordinating from town on backup power calls for help multiplying as the valley realized how unprepared it had been. Rachel Stone's voice cut through static. My kids. Can't warm them. Wood's completely soaked. Please, anyone. Ben stopped. Rachel was a single mother. 2 kids under 5. Her house sat a quarter-mile south, close enough to reach if he ignored the warning signals his body was sending. Frostbite starting on fingers despite gloves. Exhaustion creeping into muscles that had been working for hours. Core temperature dropping even with layers. The smart play was retreat, resupply. Wait for conditions to improve. Let emergency services handle it when roads opened and trained professionals could respond. Except roads wouldn't open for days. Emergency services were already overwhelmed, and kids didn't have days to wait for help that might never arrive. Ranger looked at him, reading the decision before Ben made it. The dog moved carefully but with purpose, ice building between paw pads despite the brutal conditions. They were both operating past sustainable limits, burning reserves that wouldn't replenish quickly. Going farther meant risking everything. Turning back meant living with the knowledge that he'd chosen safety over children. One more. Ben adjusted his heading compass, bearing toward Stone property. Then we're done. The journey took forever and no time at all, measured in steps that fought for every foot of progress. The sled dragged like it carried lead. The rope was weight and salvation. Ranger struggled but didn't quit determination, overriding physical cost. Rachel's house appeared through the storm door, standing open, bad sign that suggested panic or systems failing completely. Ben stumbled through into chaos. Rachel huddled in the corner with Emma and Jake, all 3 wrapped together, all 3 shaking with cold that had moved past discomfort into crisis. The boy Jake wasn't responding. His eyes stared at nothing. His skin had taken on the grayish cast that meant hypothermia had progressed past early stages into something critical. How long has he been like this? Ben's hands moved through triage, checking pulse and breathing and core temperature through clothing. 20 minutes, maybe 30. Rachel's voice broke. I tried everything. Blanket skin contact, nothing's working. Is he going to? No. Ben stripped Jake's wet clothes with hands that barely functioned. The wood in their pile sat soaked and useless, victims of a shed design that looked adequate until tested. He built fire with his own supplies, the last of what he'd brought, watching flames rise with heat that felt inadequate against the cold emanating from a 3-year-old boy. This is going to hurt. Ben wrapped Jake skin to skin against his own chest, sharing body heat directly, the only method that worked when hypothermia advanced this far. The boy was ice against his skin, stealing warmth faster than Ben could generate it. Stay with me, kid. Stay right here. Minutes stretched while the fire built and body temperatures equalized, and Jake's color shifted from gray to pale to something approaching healthy. The boy gasped, started crying, and Ben had never been so grateful to hear a child's distress. Crying meant systems functioning, meant nerves working, meant life winning against cold that had tried to claim another victim. He's okay. Rachel's whisper carried hope that didn't dare believe. He's tough. They're both tough. Ben's own shivering had intensified his core temperature, dropping from the transfer. But Jake was warming, Emma was stable, and Rachel could maintain the fire with wood he'd left. They'd survive. You saved him. Rachel held her son with grip that said she'd never let go. You saved both of them. I don't know how to... Stay inside, keep them warm. Ben moved toward the door, legs unsteady, vision starting to blur at the edges. The storm's still bad. Outside felt colder than before, if that was possible. Ben's body had burned through reserves operating on fumes and stubbornness, and the kind of determination that didn't consult biology about sustainable limits. The rope led back toward his cabin, but he'd extended so far from the original anchor point that the path crossed unfamiliar ground. Ranger stayed pressed against his leg, guiding when Ben's sense of direction started failing. The dog's movement spoke of pain endured but not surrendered to blood streaking the snow from paws damaged by ice. They were both done, both operating past failure points, both held together by mission focus that overrode damage assessment. The radio crackled. Deputy Miller's voice. Anyone near Larson Ranch? George reported barn collapse. Trapped under debris. Need immediate assistance. Ben's hands were too numb to respond, his mouth too frozen to form words. George Larson was a half-mile north, maybe more, and Ben had nothing left to give. No wood, no warmth, no reserves beyond what kept his own systems minimally functional. Going after George meant dying in the attempt. Turning back meant George dying alone. Mathematics of triage. Save the ones you can reach. Accept the ones you can't. Make peace with decisions that had no good options. Except Ben had made that peace before standing over flag-draped coffins, and the price of acceptance was every nightmare since. He couldn't save Williams and Hayes, but George Larson was still breathing, still waiting, still savable if Ben could find strength that biology insisted didn't exist. The cabin was close now, maybe 100 yards fire visible through windows that promised warmth and safety, and the smart choice that meant survival. Ben stood at the rope's limit, body shaking with cold, that had progressed into dangerous territory, mind cycling through options that all ended badly. Ranger's posture shifted, the subtle change that meant the dog knew they were spent. Knew continuing meant not coming back. Knew Ben was calculating odds that didn't favor either of them. I can't leave him. Ben's words came out slurred, hypothermia, stealing articulation. Can't let the cold win again. He turned north away from the cabin, away from safety, stepping off the rope into storm that immediately tried to erase his existence. Ranger followed loyalty overriding self-preservation, both of them committing to a mission that medical science would call suicide and military doctrine would recognize as devotion to duty that transcended personal survival. The compass bearing was approximate. Visibility was zero. Ben navigated by dead reckoning and prayer, stumbling through drifts that climbed past his knees, fighting wind that wanted him prone and still and frozen. His mind started playing tricks, showing him shapes in the white that could have been memories or hallucinations, or the edge of consciousness failing. Ranger's bark cut through confusion. The dog had found structure Larson's barn, or what remained after the roof collapsed under snow load, that exceeded design specifications. Beams lay scattered like giants' toys. Livestock had fled or died. And somewhere under the debris, George Larson waited for help that shouldn't have come but had anyway. George Ben's voice barely carried past his own ears. The storm ate sound, ate warmth, ate hope. George Larson, movement under a fallen beam. George's face appeared pale and pain-twisted leg pinned under lumber that would require equipment to move safely. His breath plumed white in air that was killing him by degrees. Carter, Christ, man, you shouldn't be out here. Nobody should be out here. Ben's fingers refused to work. Frostbite had advanced past numbness into something worse, tissue damage that would leave permanent marks if he survived long enough for marks to matter. He tried to grip the beam, tried to lift, tried to leverage using physics and desperation, but his hands wouldn't close and his arms wouldn't respond, and his body was shutting down systems in the order biology deemed least essential. I can't. Ben's knees hit snow that felt warm, which meant he was dying. Paradoxical undressing would come next, the final symptom, where hypothermia victims stripped naked in confused response to false heat. I can't move it. It's okay, you tried. George's words came from far away. Tell my wife. Tell her I... Ranger barked urgent and insistent. The dog circled Ben, nosed him hard enough to hurt, demanded response when giving up felt so much easier. Ben's vision was graying at the edges, consciousness flickering like fire running out of fuel. His hands wouldn't work. His body wouldn't respond. The cold was winning the way it always won when you fought it unprepared and exhausted and alone. Except he wasn't alone. Ranger grabbed his collar and pulled 90 pounds of determination versus 170 pounds of failing human physics that shouldn't work but did through sheer refusal to quit. The dog dragged him inch by inch away from George, away from the barn toward nothing Ben could identify through vision that had stopped processing detail. Time became meaningless. Space became theoretical. Ben floated in white that could have been storm or unconsciousness or the edge of something final. His last clear thought was apology to George dying under debris, to Ranger bleeding from paws that should have been protected, to the valley that had needed him to be stronger than biology allowed. Then voices, hands gripping his arms, heat that felt like agony against skin that had forgotten warmth existed. Tom Mason's face appearing through the white, and how Tom had left safety to search made no sense but didn't need to. Sarah was there too, and somehow Eleanor, despite her age and the storm, and they were pulling him and Ranger toward light that hurt to see. The cabin door, his cabin, fire roaring in the hearth, blankets piled until he couldn't move. Ranger collapsing beside him, both of them breathing, but not much more. Lily's small hand touching his face. You came back again. You always come back. Ben tried to respond, but words wouldn't form. His body temperature was 89 degrees, critical hypothermia, the kind that required aggressive intervention and often failed anyway. Sarah was doing something medical, her nursing training kicking in despite the chaos. Tom was radioing for help that couldn't arrive, but might matter later. Eleanor was wrapping Ranger's paws with practiced efficiency that spoke to skills Ben hadn't known she possessed. Consciousness flickered. In the moments of awareness, Ben registered that the cabin held 6 people now, plus 1 dog. That his wood supply was down to 15%. That the storm continued its assault outside walls that suddenly felt fragile. That somewhere in the valley, George Larson was either dead or dying, and Ben had failed to save him the way he'd failed before. He fought against the warmth trying to pull him under, fought against the exhaustion that said rest was earned, fought because somewhere people still needed help, and he was the only one prepared to provide it, even if preparation had proven inadequate. You're going to be okay. Sarah's voice carried authority. Your core temperature's rising. You're going to be okay, George. Ben's words slurred. Barn collapse. Trapped. Deputy Miller got him. Tom's hand gripped Ben's shoulder. Snowmobile rescue 20 minutes ago. George is alive. Broken leg, but alive. Everyone you went after survived. All of them. The words took time to process. Tom's family, Eleanor, Rachel's kids, George, all alive. All saved because one man had prepared when others had gone into the storm, when staying safe was saner, had refused to let cold win, when every biological imperative screamed for surrender. How many, Ben's question made no sense until context filled in. How many alive because of you? Tom looked at Sarah, at Eleanor, at the count they'd been keeping, while Ben fought hypothermia. 23. Deputy Miller says 23 people in 8 families. You supplied wood to 3 homes, personally rescued 5 separate groups. 23 people who'd be dead right now if you hadn't. He didn't finish. Didn't need to. The math spoke for itself. Ben had gone into the storm with 1 sled of firewood in determination that overrode survival instinct. He'd come back hypothermic and frostbitten and barely alive. The exchange rate was acceptable. Ranger's head pressed against his chest, and Ben's hand found fur that was still damp from melted snow. Good boy. Best partner I ever had. The storm screamed outside. Inside, heat built from fire fed by the last of Ben's prepared wood. The supply that was supposed to last a week now reduced to hours because 23 people had needed warmth more than he needed security. Mathematics of sacrifice. Arithmetic of giving until nothing remained except the knowledge that you'd done everything possible, and maybe that was enough. Ben's eyes closed despite fighting to keep them open. Sleep came whether he wanted it or not, pulling him under into darkness that didn't contain cold or wind or the faces of brothers who died while he watched. Just peace, temporary and fragile, and earned through action that would leave scars but had saved lives. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness claimed him was Lily reading aloud from a book, her child's voice steady in the firelight. And the hero returned from the storm, bearing gifts of warmth, and the people knew they had been wrong to doubt him, and they vowed to never doubt again. Just a story, just words, just the kind of fairy tale that bore no resemblance to reality, where heroes died and cold won, and preparation meant survival, but never guaranteed it. Except tonight, the cold hadn't won. Tonight, preparation had been enough. Tonight, 23 people breathed because one man had seen brothers freeze and sworn it wouldn't happen again. Ben's breathing deepened. The storm raged, and Black Pine Valley learned what it meant to be saved by someone they'd called paranoid. Dawn arrived with silence that felt louder than the storm had been. Ben woke to sunlight cutting through windows, no longer obscured by horizontal snow, the kind of brutal clarity that came after weather moved on and left wreckage in its wake. His body ached in ways that went beyond muscle fatigue, fingers bandaged and throbbing where frostbite had claimed tissue. Ribs protesting each breath from exertion that had pushed past sustainable limits, core temperature, normalized but fragile. Ranger lifted his head from the floor beside the cot tail, attempting a wag that became a slow sweep. The dog's paws were wrapped in gauze that Eleanor must have applied during the night, blood seeping through in spots that marked where ice had cut deepest. They'd both paid prices, both carried damage that would heal slowly if it healed at all. The cabin held warmth from embers that someone had maintained through the night. Tom sat slumped in the corner chair, asleep with mouth open, exhaustion written across features that looked older than yesterday. Sarah was curled on the floor with both kids' blankets covering them in a nest of shared body heat. Eleanor stood at the stove, moving with quiet efficiency as she prepared something that smelled like coffee and salvation. "You're awake." Eleanor's voice stayed low, not disturbing the others. "Good. Wasn't sure you'd make it through the night." Ben tried to sit up, found his body uncooperative, settled for turning his head to survey the room. "How long?" 14 hours. "You were hypothermic enough that I thought about trying to get you to town. But the roads," Eleanor poured coffee into a chipped mug and brought it to him. "Figured keeping you warm here was better than freezing in transit." The coffee was perfect, hot and bitter, and exactly what biology needed. Ben sipped carefully, feeling heat spread through his chest cavity like something miraculous. The others. Everyone's stable. Tom and Sarah stayed because their house is colder than yours, and you've still got embers going. Eleanor settled into the chair Tom had vacated when he'd moved to the floor. Deputy Miller came by around 3 snowmobile. Said the valley counted casualties and came up with 0. 0 deaths, Mr. Carter. First time in recorded history that Black Pine survived a storm this severe without losing someone. The words should have brought relief. Instead, they brought arithmetic 0 deaths this time, but those losses from before still weighed. Ben's hands shook, whether from residual hypothermia or memory's burden, he couldn't determine. What about the valley supply situation? 12 families lost their woodsheds completely. Another 8 have compromised structures. Most of the emergency wood is soaked through, won't burn for days, even if we get enough sun to dry it. Eleanor's expression was grim. We're looking at a fuel crisis across 200 people. Your structure's the only thing that came through intact. How much do I have left? Enough for this cabin for maybe 2 days. Not enough for the valley. Mathematics of disaster. Ben had prepared for personal survival, built a system that worked for one household, and now faced the reality that individual preparation couldn't solve collective crisis. The valley needed heat, needed dry wood, needed someone to coordinate distribution and prioritize resources and make decisions about who got help first when everyone needed help simultaneously. Deputy Miller's organizing. Ben forced himself upright despite protests from muscles that wanted rest. Trying to. Eleanor refilled his coffee. But Frank's a good deputy, not a crisis manager. He's overwhelmed. The town hall's running on generator power, and people are showing up demanding solutions he doesn't have. Then we need to give him solutions. Leonor's eyebrow raised. You nearly died 12 hours ago. You're still recovering from critical hypothermia. Your body needs rest, not another mission. My body needed rest in Afghanistan, too. Ben swung his legs off the cot, waited for dizziness to pass. Didn't change what needed doing. He stood wavered, caught himself on the wall. Ranger struggled upright too, limping, but determined, reading Ben's intention and refusing to be left behind. Tom stirred, blinked awake, saw Ben standing and scrambled to his feet. Jesus, Ben, you should be in bed. Tom moved like he might physically restrain him if necessary. Can't solve problems from bed. Ben pulled on boots, every movement requiring concentration. Need to see the damage. Need to know what we're working with. The door opened before Tom could argue further. Deputy Miller stepped through, snow-covered and exhausted, carrying the expression of someone who'd been making impossible decisions for too many hours. His eyes found Ben, and something like relief crossed his features. Carter, thank God. I need your help. What's the situation? Ben accepted the role before it was offered, stepping into leadership the way he'd stepped into storm, because someone had to and nobody else was moving. Miller pulled out a notepad covered in hasty scrawl. 14 families, critical. No heat, minimal food, wood supplies destroyed. Another 20 families, compromised, partial heat, dwindling supplies, maybe 2 days before they're critical. Generator at town halls running, but fuel won't last the week. Roads are impassable. State crews say 3 days minimum before they can clear routes for supply trucks. Ben's mind shifted into operational planning mode, the part of him that had coordinated logistics in hostile territory and knew how to make bad situations survivable through organization and ruthless prioritization. We need a central distribution point. Town hall generators already overtaxed. Plus we need heat, not just power. Miller hesitated. Your structure held. You've got the only reliable dry wood supply in the valley, which is enough for maybe 48 hours at current consumption. So we ration it, make it last longer. Miller's desperation was showing. Ben, people are scared. They need to see someone who knows what the hell they're doing, and right now, that's you. The weight of expectations settled across shoulders that already carried too much. Ben looked at Tom, at Sarah, and the kids stirring awake at Eleanor, watching with eyes that had seen trauma wards and knew what leadership under crisis looked like. 23 people had survived the storm because of him. 200 needed to survive what came after. All right. Ben moved toward the door, Ranger limping alongside. We organize, we prioritize. We make the supplies stretch until help arrives. Outside, the valley had transformed into something from nightmare aesthetics. Snow buried everything to depths that erased landmarks and turned familiar terrain foreign. The sun reflected off white surfaces with intensity that hurt to witness, beauty and devastation wrapped together in painful brightness. Ben's structure stood exactly as designed, roof intact, wood stacked beneath in neat rows, the only thing in visible range that looked like it had survived rather than endured. Looking at it brought no satisfaction, just recognition that good design meant nothing if it only saved one household while the community froze. We'll use my place as the hub. Ben started walking, each step requiring conscious effort. Families in critical condition get priority. We ration wood based on household size and health status. Elderly and children first. Tom fell in step beside him. You're talking about giving away everything you've got. I'm talking about making sure the valley survives until resupply. What about you? What happens when your wood runs out and you're still hypothermic and your dog can barely walk? Then I deal with it. Ben kept moving. I've been colder. They reached town hall to find chaos wrapped in emergency protocols. 40 people crowded into a space meant for 20, all talking at once, all demanding answers that Deputy Miller couldn't provide. The noise cut off when Ben entered, faces turning toward him, with expressions that ranged from gratitude to suspicion to desperate hope. Pastor Grant stood near the podium, exhaustion written across features that usually projected calm authority. Ben Carter, we were hoping you'd recovered enough to help us figure this out. Ben moved to the front, Ranger at his heel, both of them looking like survivors of battles that left visible marks. The crowd parted, giving space that felt like respect or fear, or maybe just recognition that he'd walked into weather that should have killed him and come back carrying others. Here's the situation. Ben's voice carried the flat affect of someone delivering operational briefing. Valley has maybe 5 days of fuel if we're lucky and careful. State can't reach us for 3 days minimum. That means we stretch what we have and nobody wastes anything. A man Ben didn't recognize spoke up, voice aggressive. Easy for you to say. You've got wood. The rest of us are freezing, which is why we're pooling resources. Ben met the man's eyes directly. My supply becomes valley supply. We distribute based on need, not who's got the biggest pile. That's communism. The man's sneer suggested he thought the word was damning. That's survival. Call it whatever makes you feel better, but the math doesn't care about politics. We work together or people die. Your choice, which you prefer. Silence held for 3 seconds before Pastor Grant stepped forward. Ben's right. We're a community. That means acting like one. Who needs help most? Hands went up. More than Ben had hoped, fewer than he'd feared. He started making lists, names, addresses, household composition, existing fuel status. Organization brought calm structure, imposed order on chaos, and people responded to the illusion of control even when control was mostly theater. Eleanor appeared beside him with more coffee and a granola bar that tasted like cardboard and provided calories his body desperately needed. You know you can't save everyone. Watch me try. You're one man, one injured, hypothermic, frostbitten man with their limping dog and delusions of adequacy. Then I'll be an inadequate man who tried everything. Ben finished the granola bar, better than being adequate and doing nothing. By noon, they'd established protocols. Tom and 3 other men with working trucks would handle distribution using Ben's structure as the staging point. Sarah and Eleanor would coordinate medical needs triaging, who required immediate attention versus who could wait. Deputy Miller would maintain communication with state emergency services and coordinate rescue for anyone whose condition deteriorated beyond local capability. Ben would do what he did best: assess, plan, execute. His first stop was the Mason property to evaluate what could be salvaged. The woodshed's roof was 300 yards away, crumpled against a fence line like aluminum foil. The wood beneath where it had stood was buried under 4 feet of snow that had compacted and frozen into solid ice. Tom kicked at the frozen pile. This is all useless. Completely destroyed, the wood's still good underneath. Ben studied the problem with engineer's eyes. We dig it out, stack it in the sun, let it dry. 3 days in this sunshine and it'll burn. 3 days we don't have. So we accelerate. Bring it inside buildings with heat, rotate it near fires, use the town hall generator to run space heaters that dry wood faster than nature would. That'll burn through generator fuel. Everything's a trade-off. Ben started toward Tom's house. Show me what else needs fixing. They spent the afternoon cataloging damaged roof leaks, broken windows, compromised insulation, all the ways that structures designed for normal Montana winters failed when weather exceeded design parameters. Each problem had a solution, but solutions required materials and labor in time that was measured in hours before the next cold front arrived. Rachel Stone's house needed window replacement where wind had shattered glass and let storm inside. The Larson Ranch required barn repairs before livestock froze. The church had structural damage that made it unsafe for gathering, even though it was the only building large enough for community meetings. Every problem multiplied into 10 more, and Ben's list grew until it represented weeks of work that needed completion in days. You can't do all this. Tom watched Ben sketch repairs on notepad paper already covered in diagrams. Nobody can do all this. Then we prioritize. Critical needs first. Shelter, heat, medical. Everything else waits. George Larson appeared as they finished the barn assessment, moving on crutches with his leg in a splint that Deputy Miller had fashioned from branches and duct tape. The rancher's face carried gratitude, mixed with something harder to name, maybe shame, maybe recognition of debt that couldn't be repaid. Carter, you came back for me. Miller said you collapsed trying to get that beam moved. Ranger found you. Ben gestured at the dog, limping beside him. I just followed. Don't sell yourself short. George's voice cracked. I was dying under there. Made my peace with it. Then you showed up, half frozen, and tried anyway. That kind of stubborn. Man, I don't know how to thank you. Help Tom distribute firewood. That's thanks enough. They worked until dark, moving from property to property, assessing damage, and determining what could be salvaged versus what needed complete replacement. Every house told the same story: people had prepared for normal winter-built structures, adequate for predictable weather, trusted that experience would guide them through whatever came. The storm had exposed how fragile that trust was, how quickly normal became catastrophic when variables shifted beyond historical parameters. Ben's body screamed for rest by the time they returned to his cabin. His fingers throbbed where frostbite had damaged nerve-ending zones. His chest ached with cold that had settled deep and wouldn't fully leave for weeks. But rest meant stopping, and stopping meant thinking about losses that preparedness couldn't prevent. Eleanor had stayed at the cabin, maintaining the fire and preparing something that smelled like venison stew. Lily and Max were drawing pictures at the table, their mother watching with exhaustion that went beyond physical. Ranger collapsed near the hearth, barely acknowledging Ben's return before sleep claimed him. 20 families got deliveries today. Eleanor ladled stew into bowls. Another 12 scheduled for tomorrow. We're stretching your wood supply across the whole valley. How long will it last? 4 days if everyone rations properly. Less if they don't. State crews will be here in 3, if weather holds. Eleanor met his eyes with nurse's pragmatism. Radio says another system developing. Smaller than the last one, but coming fast. When day after tomorrow. Ben sat heavily accepting stew he didn't taste. 2 days to prepare for another storm when they were still recovering from the first. 2 days to stretch supplies that were already inadequate. 2 days to turn a valley of unprepared individuals into a community capable of weathering crisis. The mathematics were impossible, but impossible had never stopped him before. Morning of November 5th brought clear skies and temperatures that felt almost merciful. Ben woke before dawn, body protesting every movement, but mind already running through task lists that needed completion before the next weather system arrived. Ranger struggled upright, favoring his injured paws, and together they stepped into cold that still had teeth but lacked the killing intensity of 2 days prior. The valley was stirring smoke rising from chimneys as families burned through wood supplies they'd rationed overnight. Ben's structure held maybe 15% of its original supply, and that was being generous with estimates. Today he'd distribute half of what remained. Tomorrow the rest. Then they'd rely on salvaged wood and prayer. Tom arrived at 7 with his truck and 2 teenage sons who looked at Ben like he was something between hero and crazy person. They loaded firewood in silence, efficient movements that came from growing up on a farm where work was religion and complaint was sin. Larson Ranch first. Tom consulted the list Eleanor had prepared. Then the Price property, then Rachel Stone, then the church, so Pastor Grant can keep services going. Services. Ben secured the load with rope that had saved his life 2 days ago. People are worried about heat, and you want them worried about salvation. People need hope more than heat sometimes. Tom climbed into the driver's seat. Besides, church is where community happens. We lose that we're just individuals freezing separately. They made rounds through morning and into afternoon, delivering wood in carefully calculated portions that balanced need against scarcity. At every stop, people offered thanks that felt too large for what Ben had done, gratitude that assumed he'd chosen to help rather than acknowledging he'd had no real choice. You don't turn away from brothers, and the storm had made the whole valley brothers, whether they'd wanted that bond or not. Eleanor was waiting when they returned, face grave in ways that suggested new complications. We've got a problem. Deputy Miller just radioed. The Johnson family up north, their baby's running fever and they're out of fuel. Generator quit, house is barely 40 degrees. And with this cold, how old's the baby? 3 months. Eleanor's medical training was showing in the precision of detail. Fever's 101, likely infection, needs antibiotics and warmth immediately. But the road to their place is completely buried. Ben's mind shifted through logistics. Snowmobile Miller's is broken. Won't start. Tom's is in pieces in his garage, winter maintenance he hadn't finished when the storm hit. Then we walk. Tom stared. It's 5 miles through snowdrifts. You're still recovering from hypothermia. That's suicide. It's a baby. Ben was already moving toward supplies. 3 months old means vulnerable, means we don't wait for convenient solutions. Eleanor blocked his path, small but immovable. I'm going with you. Baby needs medical assessment I can provide. You need someone who knows what they're doing if things go wrong. You're 72, and I've got more experience treating hypothermia than you do. Plus, someone needs to stop you from being heroically stupid. Ben looked at her, saw determination that matched his own, recognized that arguing would waste time they didn't have. Ranger was already at the door, reading intention and preparing. Despite paws that hadn't fully healed. They were all damaged, all operating past sustainable limits, all committed to missions that logic called impossible. We leave in 10 minutes. Ben started gathering gear: emergency medical kit, chemical heat packs, insulated blankets, the kind of supplies you carried when failure meant death. Tom, keep distributing. We'll radio when we're back. The walk to the Johnson property took 3 hours of brutal effort through snow that sometimes reached Ben's waist. Eleanor moved with surprising efficiency for her age, using ski poles for balance and keeping pace despite the terrain trying to kill forward progress. Ranger ranged ahead, finding the path of least resistance, conserving energy they'd all need for the return journey. The Johnson house appeared through afternoon light that was already starting to fail. Young couple, maybe late 20s, the kind who'd moved to Montana for the beauty and discovered, too late, that beauty came with costs. The husband, James, answered the door with eyes that held relief and desperation in equal measure. Thank God. Miller said he couldn't reach us. The baby, she's getting worse. My wife's terrified. I don't know what to do. Inside was cold enough to see breath, but warmer than outside. The wife, Anna, sat wrapped in blankets holding an infant whose face was flushed with fever. Eleanor moved immediately to assessment mode, checking temperature and breathing, and all the vital signs that determined whether intervention could happen here or required evacuation they couldn't provide. It's an ear infection. Eleanor's voice carried professional calm. Needs antibiotics and fever management, but it's treatable if we act fast. We don't have antibiotics. Anna's whisper carried defeat. Lost our supply bag when the shed collapsed. Everything's buried or destroyed. Eleanor pulled a small case from her coat. Never travel without emergency pharmaceuticals, old habit from trauma nursing. She prepared a syringe with practiced efficiency. This'll bring the fever down. The antibiotics will take a few hours to work, but she should start improving by tonight. Ben was already building fire with wood they'd hauled specifically for this purpose. Heat rose from flames that felt like answered prayer, and color started returning to Anna's face as warmth pushed back against cold that had been winning. You walked here, James's voice held wonder. 5 miles through this just to help us. Couldn't let a baby freeze. Ben fed the fire larger pieces. You've got enough wood here for 3 days. Ration it. Keep the house warm but not hot. State crews should be through by then. We owe you everything. Anna held her daughter closer, tears tracking down cheeks that were warming from hypothermic pale to healthy flush. Both of you, I don't know how to repay this. Raise your daughter. Eleanor repacked her medical kit with movements that suggested she'd done this 10,000 times before. Teach her to prepare better than her parents did. That's payment enough. They stayed 2 hours ensuring the baby's fever broke and the house stabilized, and the young family understood how to maintain heat without burning through supplies too quickly. Then came the walk back, harder than the journey out, because exhaustion had accumulated and darkness was falling and the temperature dropped 10 degrees with the sun. Halfway home, Ben's legs gave out. Simple mechanical failure muscles pushed past tolerance and finally refusing commands. He sat in the snow that felt warm, which meant hypothermia was returning, and tried to summon strength that biology insisted didn't exist. Get up, Eleanor's voice carried Sergeant's authority. You don't get to quit on me, Carter. We're too close. Can't. The word came out slurred. Need a minute. You need to move. Now, Eleanor grabbed his arm with grip strength that belied her age. That baby survives because you walk through hell to reach her. You don't get to die in the snow 2 miles from home. Ranger pressed against his other side, adding warmth and weight and silent insistence. Between the old woman and the injured dog, they got Ben upright and moving one step at a time, covering distance measured in feet instead of miles, but moving nonetheless. Tom found them a mile from the cabin, his truck pushing through drifts with chains on the tires, and determination overriding mechanical limitations. He loaded all 3 of them, Ben, Eleanor, and Ranger, into the heated cab and drove them home while Ben's consciousness flickered between present and past, between Montana snow and Afghan mountains, between survival and the edge of something final. The cabin held more people when they arrived. Sarah and the kids, Pastor Grant, Deputy Miller, George Larson on his crutches, Rachel Stone with Emma and Jake, all of them waiting, all of them worried, all of them representing the lives that had become Ben's responsibility, whether he'd wanted that burden or not. He's okay, Eleanor announced it like medical verdict. Hypothermic, again exhausted beyond rational limits, but okay. The baby's fine too, thanks to him refusing to let impossible be an answer. Someone, probably as Sarah, guided Ben to the cot. Someone else piled blankets that felt like drowning in warmth. Ranger collapsed beside him, and Ben's hand found fur that was damp with melted snow and blood from reopened wounds. They'd both paid prices. They'd both do it again tomorrow if tomorrow brought more people who needed saving. Miller's voice cut through the fog. State crews are coming tomorrow. Roads will be clear by noon. We made it, Ben. The valley made it because you made it possible. Ben wanted to argue, wanted to say that survival was always temporary and cold always patient, that he'd just postponed inevitable losses rather than prevented them. But consciousness was fading and words were too heavy, and maybe just for tonight he could accept that he'd done enough. The room filled with a quiet conversation, people sharing stories of rescue and survival of the veteran who'd walked into the storm and carried half the valley back from the edge. But the baby would live. The valley would survive. 23 had become 26, and maybe that mathematics was enough. Ben's breathing deepened into sleep. The valley kept watch, and somewhere in the cold Montana dark winter acknowledged that this time preparation had won.